Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jauhar. I work as a consultant psychiatrist looking after young people with psychosis and as a research fellow here. And my talk is covering the dopamine hypothesis, which most of you will be aware of. I guess it's one of the most cited biological theories in clinical neuroscience, not just psychiatry. And like any good bit of psychiatric research, it's based on observation, treatment, and just a wee bit of luck and serendipity. So we've had the observation that drugs working on the dopamine system, such as amphetamines, can recreate positive psychotic symptoms, delusions, hallucinations. That's a quote from 1565 in regard to cocaine. We had dexedrine coming along in the 50s and 60s. But the big thing, I guess, was 1952, when chlorpromazine was shown to be effective for the symptoms of psychosis. And further work at that time was able to distill down that chlorpromazine had its effects by binding to dopamine receptors. So you have drugs that increase production of dopamine for people that can create positive psychotic symptoms, and you have the serendipitous finding that a drug that works exerts its effects by working on the dopamine system. So fast forward 40 years, where are we now? Well, our way of looking at the dopamine system is probably best done through molecular imaging, where we can give radioactive isotope in small amounts, tag an enzyme system or a receptor system. And what do we find in psychosis? We find an elevation in presynaptic dopamine in people with illness compared to people without illness. But I'm a clinician, and illness versus non-illness, that doesn't really help me. But what does help me is tagging it with what I see clinically. We know that a third of people do not have a response to antipsychotic treatment, and in a significant proportion, that's there from illness onset. So you want to know, actually, what's happening with that system for people when they first present, and how does that correlate with our measure of the dopamine system. And prior to our studies, there was one study in people with established illness taking medication, which found elevated dopamine synthesis capacity in people who had a response, and no difference between non-responders and controls in the dopamine system. Ideally, you do a study to look at people at the onset of illness, without the confounds of having illness for a long period of time, or the confound of taking antipsychotic medication and follow them up. And also our treatments never worked for illnesses. Our treatments always work for symptoms. So you'd like to take your measure and you'd like to correlate it with symptom measures and see actually, are our biological measures transdiagnostic? Do they refute illness boundaries? So these were the hypotheses that I had. Does baseline dopamine synthesis capacity predict antipsychotic response in people with first episode psychosis? Can we discriminate people who get a good response from people who have a poor response at illness onset? And the last question, is there a relationship between dopamine synthesis capacity and psychotic symptoms irrespective of diagnosis? Or better still, does Mother Nature read the DSM? And this is what we found. So, if I take you to the top left, baseline dopamine synthesis capacity did have a relationship to response to antipsychotic treatment. The more erudite, and you're all erudite obviously, will say, well, you're only able to explain 36% of the variance, but for imaging that's okay. We're able to discriminate at baseline between responders to antipsychotics and non-responders. And at the bottom, when we looked at people with bipolar psychoses compared to people with schizophrenia psychoses, illness constructs, just the illness constructs of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, we found an elevation in dopamine synthesis capacity. But I think the most interesting thing there is the bottom right, because irrespective of your diagnosis, your symptoms correlated with dopamine synthesis capacity. So in essence, yes, Mother Nature does not read the DSM, and she probably shouldn't. So thank you very much.